If you've been scrolling through endless kiln listings, watching video after video of people touting the best model, and still feel like you're stuck in a loop of indecision, this review is here to cut through the noise. I've spent a good chunk of time looking at what hobby crafters, small batch ceramicists, and even a few commercial studios say about the practical side of a kiln before they actually fire their first piece. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. What you'll hear today isn't a dry rundown of voltage numbers or a copy-pasted spec sheet. It's a walkthrough of the day-to-day reality of using the Skutt KM1027LL with its shelf kit and Envirovent system. First off, the biggest hesitation most people have is the fear of overpaying for a kiln that ends up being a storage unit rather than a workhorse. The Skutt brand has a reputation for reliability, but that reputation can also set a high price expectation. The KM1027LL lands in the mid-range price tier, which for many hobbyists feels like a gamble, especially if you've only ever fired a few test pieces and aren't sure how often you'll actually use the equipment. That's why the versatile size claim matters more than the numbers on the label. At 27 inches high, the interior can handle a decent batch of plates, mugs, or small sculptures in one go, yet it still fits comfortably on a standard garage shelf or a dedicated studio corner. If your space is a cramped apartment loft, you'll appreciate that you can tuck it in without sacrificing a whole wall. The smart controller is another point that people either love or ignore. Skutt's controller lets you set a ramp-up profile, hold temperature, and then cool down automatically. In real-world terms, this means you can walk out of the studio, set a 2-hour bisque fire, and come back to a kiln that has already cooled to a safe temperature for handling. I've seen beginners try to watch the kiln the whole time and end up with burnt pieces simply because they misjudged the cooling curve. With the controller handling the ramp, the risk of thermal shock drops dramatically. That said, the controller's menu isn't the most intuitive for someone who isn't used to digital interfaces. There's a learning curve if you're accustomed to the old-school no-bandial models. It's not a deal breaker, but you should be prepared to spend a few minutes with the manual before your first fire. Ease of use is a buzzword that often hides hidden complexities, but with the KM1027LL, it's fairly literal. The door opens with a single pull, the shelves slide in and out on a low-friction rail, and the wiring for the Envirovent fan is pre-wired. The Envirovent system circulates hot air inside the chamber, which helps eliminate hot spots, a common annoyance when you're trying to achieve even glaze coverage on a set of mugs. In practice, I've watched a small studio use the Envirovent to run a glaze fire on a Saturday morning, and the results were noticeably more consistent than a similar kiln without the fan. The trade-off is that the fan adds a faint humming noise during the high-temperature phase, which is audible if your work area doubles as a living space. It's not a roar, but if you need absolute silence for a podcast or a meditation studio, you might want to consider placement or an additional sound dampening solution. Durability is where Skutt usually earns its stripes. The kiln's outer shell is a thick steel panel with a powder coat finish that resists scratches and the occasional bump from a misplaced tool cart. Over the course of a year, a user who fires a mix of stoneware and earthenware reported no warping or loss of insulation. The real test of durability, however, comes when you're moving the kiln between locations. The KM1027LL is marketed as portable, and indeed the weight sits around 250 pounds, heavy enough to feel solid, but light enough that 2 people can lift it onto a dolly. The built-in handles make the process smoother, but you'll still need a clear path and a bit of muscle. If you're planning to move it from a garage studio to a shared maker space every month, factor in that extra logistical step. Now, who should actually consider buying this kit? If you're a hobbyist who has outgrown a tabletop kiln but isn't ready to commit to a full-size studio furnace, the KM1027LL hits a sweet spot. Its size lets you experiment with small production runs. Think a batch of 12 mugs or a handful of decorative plates without the expense of a commercial-grade unit. The included shelf kit adds flexibility. You can stack 3 shelves and arrange them for different firing profiles, which is a real time saver when you're juggling multiple projects. Artists who work with low-fire glazes or who need a reliable bisque fire for a weekly class will find the controller and Envirovent especially useful because they reduce the guesswork and help keep the class schedule on track. Conversely, if you're a full-time potter who's